Good morning. If you would, open your Bibles with me to Matthew 24. The book of Matthew, chapter 24. Have you ever asked somebody a question that you thought maybe was a simple question, and then you got a very lengthy answer? I remember when I used to work with some engineers, I would ask a question that I expected a very simple answer to. I would ask something along the lines of, when is this going to be done? And then they would proceed to give me a 10-minute answer and explain all of the nuances and intricacies of whatever feature that they were working on at the time. And by the time they were done, I realized that what I had asked apparently wasn't so simple after all. It's apparently a much more complex issue than I had realized. And that's exactly what happened to the disciples here in Matthew 24. I want you to notice the question that they ask Jesus in verse 3. Verse 3 of Matthew 24, it says, "As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, 'Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?'" And so this is a one-verse question that they ask, and Jesus gives them a two-chapter answer. Matthew 24 through 25 gives us his answer to this question that the disciples asked, and it is the longest recorded answer that the Lord ever gave. This section of Scripture is known as being the discourse, the Olivet discourse, because of its location. It occurred on the Mount of Olives, but I have titled this section "The Final Word on Final Things." And that is because what is being dealt with here is everything that is final. This is the final discourse in Matthew's gospel. After this, the Lord will be arrested and tried and crucified. And this is the last official discourse that is recorded in Matthew's gospel. And so in a sense, this is his final word, his final words really here in Matthew 24 through 25. And not only is it his final word, as I said before, it concerns final things. Now, there are two major events that are in view in Matthew 24 and 25, and we have to be very clear about what those are. The first is the judgment of Jerusalem. That is what occurred in AD 70, whenever the Roman armies laid siege to the city and eventually burned it down. They killed very many of the Jews, and those who they did not kill, they enslaved. This is the judgment of Jerusalem, and this is one of the major events that is being dealt with in this text. But then we have the judgment of the world, the judgment that is yet to occur, which is going to happen when the Lord returns in a literal sense, and he ushers us in to be judged before his throne. And so these are the two major events that he is dealing with throughout this text. And while there are certainly similarities between these two events in that they are both acts of judgment, and there are going to be some similarities that we see, some likeness across these two events, they are very much distinct. And we have to make sure that we keep that distinction in mind as we read through this text. Otherwise, it'll become a Gordian's knot, and we won't really be able to discern between what he is talking about in this part and what he is talking about in that part. It's going to be very difficult to understand which of the two he is referencing. And so what we need to do is distinguish between these two events. And fortunately, Jesus gives us a very clear marker of which of these two events he has in mind in the first section. I want you to notice what he says in verse 34. Jump ahead for just a moment to verse 24, or rather, verse 34 of chapter 24, and notice what Jesus says there. He says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." That, I think, is probably the clearest indicator we have of which of these two events he is going to be dealing with first. He is saying that everything that he has said up until that point, all of these things from verses 4 all the way to verse 34, the Lord assigns to the first generation, the generation in which he was living, the generation that was then existing. And so what we can safely conclude is that everything up until this threshold must have reference to the judgment of Jerusalem, because that was the first generation, the judgment that occurred there. And so we need to make sense of it within that context. But this is going to be the sort of dividing line, and we're going to spend the first hour, this hour, going through the judgment of Jerusalem. We're going to work our way up until this threshold, verse 34. And then after that, we're going to look at the judgment on the world, and that'll be part 2 in the 11 a.m. And in part 2, we're going to be considering the judgment that is yet to come. But having said that, let us turn and consider the judgment of Jerusalem. That is going to be our focus in the 9 a.m. hours, the judgment of Jerusalem. We're going to take this in sections. There are 4 or 5 sections here, and we're just going to divide this up so that we can have a better idea of the flow of thought and of what is going on throughout this text. So we're going to start in verse 1. We're going to back up to Matthew 24, verse 1, and we're going to read through verse 3. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Now, in order to understand why the disciples are pointing out the temple to Jesus here, we have to back up to chapter 23, because in chapter 23, the Lord gave another discourse or sermon in which he gives a scathing rebuke of the scribes and the Pharisees, but he concludes it on a more tender note. But within the concluding verses, he alludes to a very ominous event. He says in verse 36 of Matthew 23, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate." So that is why the disciples are pointing out the temple to Jesus at this point. It's because in the immediately before, he had made this very sort of vague statement, but it was very clear what he was saying. He said, "See, your house is left to you desolate or empty or unoccupied." He's saying that the house of God, the temple that then stood, was left to them desolate. Well, at that moment, the temple was not desolate. The temple was teeming with people, and it was as magnificent as ever. And so as they're leaving the temple, the disciples speak up. One of them in particular says to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." This is Mark 13:1. Mark adds this detail in his account of this occasion. And so what the disciple is doing is kind of subtly contradicting what the Lord had said. The Lord had said that the house of God, or the temple, was going to be left to them desolate. And now this disciple is pointing out to him just how remarkable this structure was. And indeed, the temple at that time was a truly remarkable structure. And from their perspective, it was something that was to be admired. And so the disciples are pointing this out to him and sort of, in a way, asking, "Are you really saying that this is ever going to be desolate? Are you really saying that this great house of God is ever going to be left empty?" Well, then Jesus doubles down on what he said in chapter 23, and he says, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And so here he gets even more explicit about what he had said in chapter 23. Here he is telling them that not only will the temple be left to them desolate, that is, empty or unoccupied, it is also going to be utterly destroyed. He says that this great structure, this temple, is going to be completely dismantled. Not one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Now, this was one of the most unlikely things that Jesus had ever said. And his disciples, as they're looking at this temple, cannot even imagine that such an event would ever occur. Because as we said, at this point, everything seemed to be very, very peaceful, very prosperous. At this time, there was really no major conflicts between the Hebrew people and the Romans. And the Roman government generally did not interfere with the religions of those who were within the empire unless it became an issue. They tended to sort of live and let live. And so it seemed very strange that there would ever be a time in which their religious liberties and the structure which represented it would ever be thrown down. And so his disciples ask him as they leave the temple and go across to the Mount of Olives, and they now have this panoramic view of the temple. They ask Jesus privately and say to him, "What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So Jesus has made some very significant predictions here. He's made a very bold prediction saying that the temple is going to be completely dismantled. And so naturally they have some questions. If somebody had told us that the White House or the Statue of Liberty was going to be destroyed, we would have some questions as well. So naturally they ask him, "When will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Now, the question that they ask and the way that they phrase it seems to indicate that they thought that this was going to be one singular event, that when the temple was destroyed, that was going to indicate the end of the age. That was going to indicate the end of all things. It was going to be the end of the world, and it was going to be the final return of the Son of Man. And we have to keep in mind that they really didn't know what they were talking about here. They're still very much in their spiritual infancy. They didn't even understand at this point that Jesus was going to be crucified and resurrected. And so whatever their concept was of the final judgment, whatever their concept was of the end of the age, I think we can be sure that they did not fully grasp the scope and extent of what they were asking here. But in spite of their ignorance, Jesus gives them an answer. He gives them an answer, and that answer, as we said, is going to take up all of chapter 24 and chapter 25. And he's going to show them that although these two judgments were very similar in some ways, the judgment of Jerusalem and the judgment of the world, he's going to show them that these were very much distinct. And he's going to show them which things pertain to the judgment of Jerusalem and which things pertain to the judgment of the world. But this is the first section we have here, is the primary prediction in verse 2. And it's very important that we start here because this is going to determine the shape of this discourse. This is really what occasioned these statements that Jesus makes in chapters 24 and 25, is what he says in verse 3, that this temple is going to be dismantled, not one stone upon another will not be thrown down. And so that is the primary prediction. And what he's going to do from this point forward is walk them through the events that are going to precede it. They had asked, when will these things be? And he's going to take them basically slowly through the series of events that is going to culminate in this destruction, in the fulfillment of this prediction he made in verse 2. So having seen the primary prediction, let us move on to the next section, which I've titled The Lesser Tribulations. This is verse 4 through verse 14. This is the lesser tribulations. These are going to be things that Jesus is going to foretell as being occurring prior to the destruction of the temple, but these are going to be things that are not indicative of its destruction. And so notice what he says starting in verse 4. He says, "See that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death. And you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come." And so here we have a description of things that were going to be occurring throughout the world prior to the destruction of the temple. And Jesus wants them to understand that these things were going to happen, but he did not want them to have a premature expectation of the destruction of the temple and by extension the destruction of Jerusalem. And so he tells them, see that no one leads you astray. And the reason that he's warning them of this is because during this period there was going to be many false messiahs, many people who claimed to be the Christ who led many astray. He also predicts that there's going to be national conflicts, that there's going to be wars and rumors of wars, that nations are going to rise up against nations, kingdoms against kingdoms, and then he predicts that there will also be natural disasters such as famines and earthquakes. And all of these things were in abundance in the first century leading up to the destruction of the temple. Josephus verifies that all of these things were going on. There were many false messiahs who were rising up just prior to the destruction of Jerusalem. There were wars all over the Roman Empire, and there were natural disasters such as earthquakes and famines that were occurring time and time again. In fact, there were so many of these earthquakes that many of the cities in Asia Minor were destroyed as a result. And the book of Acts even gives us some further verification of these events. In Acts 11:28, a prophet by the name of Agabus had foretold by the Spirit that there would be a great famine all over the world. And then Luke adds in parenthesis that this took place in the days of Claudius. And so what we're seeing in this first little section here is that all of these things that Jesus predicted were taking place within the first century. These were all things that were leading up to the destruction of the temple. And Jesus wanted to make sure that they understood that these things were but the beginning of the birth pains, he says in verse 8. These things were not indicative of the end. And then he tells them, starting in verse 9, that there was going to be religious persecution. He says that they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And the events that he's describing here align very well with the early church persecution. Everything that he says concerning the tribulation that the Christians were going to endure, being put to death, being hated by all nations for his name's sake, is very much in line with what we see all throughout the New Testament. In Acts chapter 8, verse 1, Luke says, and there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria. And so this too was fulfilled prior to the destruction of Jerusalem. And then he says that there was going to be apostasy, that during this time lawlessness would be increased, the love of many would grow cold, there was going to be false prophets who arose and led many astray, and this too was very much going on throughout the first century. And we can see throughout nearly all of the New Testament epistles that there was apostasy, there was false teachers, and there were many who were being led astray by these false teachers. In John chapter 4, verse 1, 1 John rather, chapter 4, verse 1, he says that many false prophets have gone out into the world. He says again in 2 John 7, many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. So all of these things, whether it was the messianic deception, the national conflicts, the natural disasters, the religious persecution, and the apostasy that accompanied it, was going on prior to the destruction of Jerusalem. And they needed to understand that these things were going to occur, and they needed to be prepared for them, and they needed to endure them. That is why he says in verse 13 of our text, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. Now, this is true not just in the context of the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, but also of the final judgment. But remember, this is primarily dealing with the judgment against Jerusalem. And I believe that what he's talking about here, the salvation that he's referring to here, is not so much the salvation that will occur whenever he returns at the end of the age, but rather the salvation from the Jewish persecution that they were going to endure. And the reason that I believe that is not only because we are still behind that passage in verse 34, which sort of gives us the dividing line between the judgment of Jerusalem and the judgment of the world, but in a parallel passage, Jesus says basically the same thing, but he adds an important detail. Back in Matthew 10, verses 22 through 23, he says, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. So that's almost verbatim what we have just read is that there's going to be this hatred for Christians, and one who endures to the end will be saved. But notice what he says immediately after this. He says, when they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. For truly I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Now, if he's referring to his literal coming on the final day of judgment, then this promise was not kept, because this did not occur while they were still going through the towns of Israel. But if he is referring to his fulfillment of his promise regarding the destruction of the temple and by extension the end of the Jewish persecution, then this was fulfilled, because there were many of the Christians who, while they were still going through these towns and fleeing from persecution, who were able to see the end of that persecution. They were, in a sense, saved from that persecution while they were yet going through these towns of Judea. And so whenever Jesus says the one who endures to the end will be saved, I still think he is referring to here the end of the persecution, the end of what was going on prior to the destruction of Jerusalem. And so then he says after that the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And it's important to note here that he does not say all people or all individuals. He says that it will be proclaimed to all nations. That is a Greek word ethnos, from which we get the English word ethnic or ethnicity. He's not saying that every single person was going to hear the gospel prior to the end, but that the Gentile world as a whole was going to be evangelized, and they most certainly were. We read in Acts chapter 2, verse 5, this is immediately after the resurrection and the ascension. There were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. And this is the audience to whom the first gospel sermon was preached to. They were from all over the Roman Empire, and they were all present for this first gospel sermon. And then we jump forward 30 years later, about AD 60 or 62, and Paul makes a very important statement in Colossians 1:23. He says that the gospel that you heard had been proclaimed in all creation under heaven. And so Paul is verifying the fact that prior to the destruction of the temple, the Gentile world had been evangelized. The nations had heard the gospel. It had been proclaimed throughout the empire. And then the Lord says the end will come. And as I said before, I don't believe the end here is the end of the age which they had asked about. In fact, this is a different word that he uses than the word they used when they asked about the end of the age. I believe that the end here is not the end of the world, not the end of all things, but rather the end of the Jewish state, the end of the Jewish temple, and by extension, the end of the Jewish persecution, which he has described in this section. So that is the lesser tribulations, the things that are leading up to the great tribulation, which we are going to look at next in verses 15 through 28. In verse 15, the Lord says, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, 'Look, here's the Christ,' or 'There he is,' do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, 'Look, he is in the wilderness,' do not go out. If they say, 'Look, he is in the inner rooms,' do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather." And so here we have the great tribulation. He talked about tribulation in the prior section, but these were, as I said, lesser tribulations. These were things that were not indicative of the end. These were, as Jesus said, the beginning of the birth pains. But now, in this section, he is giving us the event which was going to signal the end of the temple, the destruction of the temple. He says, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." And we don't have time to deal with Daniel's prophecy or to break this down as finely as I would like to. But just to clarify what he's talking about here, we can look over to Luke's parallel account in Luke 21:20. Jesus clarifies there. He says, "When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near." This was an explicit sign that indicated the end of the temple, the end of the Jewish state, and the destruction and desolation of Jerusalem. When the Roman armies approached that city and when they were preparing to lay siege to it, this was indicative of the great tribulation that was going to follow. And so the abomination of desolation, simply put, is the Roman armies who were going to approach the city of Jerusalem. This was the thing that they needed to be looking for, because all these other things, he said, were not indicative of the end. The earthquakes, the false messiahs, the wars and rumors of wars, all of those things, he says, were the beginning. But now he is telling them that the approach of the Roman armies were signaling, indicating that the end had come near. What followed after this was the great tribulation. He says in verse 21, "For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be." This is why they needed to escape and flee into the mountains, is because once the armies approached the city of Jerusalem, it was going to result in a lengthy siege against that city, a 5-month siege to be exact, that would begin in April and last until the end of August. And so what they needed to do as soon as they saw the Roman armies approaching is flee for the mountains. This great tribulation that is being described here is the siege of the Roman army against the city of Jerusalem. In Luke's account, he clarifies further. He says, "For there will be great distress upon the earth and wrath against this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles." That is what is being described in this section of Matthew 24, is the trampling of Jerusalem by the Roman army. And we see that this was a horrific siege indeed. We read from the historian Josephus, who records some of the events that took place. He says, "And now rushing into the city, they," that is the Romans, "slew whomsoever they found without distinction and burnt the houses and all the people who had fled into them. And when they had entered for the sake of plunder, they found whole families of dead persons and houses full of carcasses destroyed by famine. Then they came out with their hands empty, and they killed all they met, whereby they filled the lanes with dead bodies. The whole city ran with blood, insomuch that many things which were burning were extinguished by the blood." And he explains that those who were not killed by the sword were tortured and then crucified. He says many hundreds were first whipped, then tormented with various kinds of tortures, and finally crucified. The Roman soldiers nailing them to crosses until at length the multitude became so great that room was wanting for crosses and crosses for the bodies. And the reason that I include these descriptions is so we understand just how horrific this tribulation truly was. This was indeed a historic tragedy that was unparalleled by any other event. This was something that was fulfilled to the very letter. Jesus said that there was going to be this historic tribulation during this 5-month siege, and there most certainly was. There was bloodshed, there was famine, and as a result of the famine, there was horrific forms of cannibalism. There were those who chewed on leather straps just for sustenance, those who boiled and ate nursing infants because of the desperate straits that they were in. And so we have to understand that this tribulation that is being described here is not something that is yet to come. It is not something that we are waiting for today. It is something that has already occurred during this 5-month siege against Jerusalem. And during this time, Jesus warns them that there is going to be a faulty expectation for deliverance. He says, if anyone says to you, "Look, here is the Christ," or "there he is," do not believe it. See, the Jews believed that the Messiah was going to come from the wilderness. He was going to come from some mysterious place, and he was going to come in and rescue them. And this was something that I think the siege against Jerusalem seemed to create a heightened expectation because people were desperate, they were looking for salvation, and many false messiahs took advantage of this desperation. And Jesus warned them and said, "I've told you beforehand, do not believe it." He says, in contrast to what they expected, this faulty expectation, the coming of the Son of Man, he says, will be as lightning coming from the east and shining as far as the west. He's saying it's going to be plainly manifest. It's going to be obvious and everyone's going to see it. You don't have to go to the wilderness to see it. You don't have to go to an inner room. It's going to be like lightning that comes from the east and shines as far as the west. Now, this is true of both judgments, both the judgment against Jerusalem and the judgment against the world. However, I still believe that what is primarily in view here is the judgment against Jerusalem. We have still not crossed that threshold in verse 34 where he says that this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And his coming against Jerusalem whenever the Roman armies sieged the city and destroyed the temple was plainly manifest. It was abundantly obvious, and it was not something that anyone had to go looking for. It was right there before their very eyes. He said, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. This is just a proverbial expression that lets them know the certainty of their demise. It was going to happen as surely as the vultures will gather around a dead corpse, the Roman armies would gather and consume the city of Jerusalem. And so that is the Great Tribulation. This brings us to the climax of this section, the grand climax in verses 29 through 31. Begin reading with me in verse 29, and we will read through verse 31. He says, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other." Now, this is where it seems like he jumps ahead, because up until this point, we have been able to assign all of the events that we have read, the lesser tribulations, the great tribulation, we've been able to assign all of it to the first century, to the siege against Jerusalem and everything that took place prior to it. But this is where it sounds like he's talking about the final judgment. It sounds as though he is referring to not just the end of the Jewish state, but rather the end of the world in its entirety. But I want you to notice a very crucial word that he uses. He says immediately. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, these things are going to occur. And that's a word that just means that straight away or an immediate result. This is what Matthew uses to indicate something that follows immediately after another thing. So whenever Jesus called Peter and Andrew to come and follow him, it says immediately they left their nets and followed him. And so what we're seeing here is that Jesus is still very much dealing with the events of that first century. He has not yet jumped ahead to the end of time. He is not jumping ahead to the final judgment. He's dealing with things that would take place immediately after the siege, the Great Tribulation, which we had just looked at. Remember that he started with the primary prediction in verse 2. He said in verse 2 of this chapter, regarding the temple, "Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And his disciples said, "When will these things be?" And slowly he has led them to the fulfillment of this prediction. He showed them the lesser tribulations, he showed them the great tribulation, and now he has brought them to the fulfillment of that very prophecy, the burning and destruction of the Jewish temple. And that is what is being described, I believe, here in this section. This is the climax of his discourse thus far. He has led us slowly to the fulfillment of this bold prediction he made regarding the burning of the temple, and this, I believe, is what he is describing here. If you think about the siege as the Great Tribulation, when the siege occurred, the burning of the temple came later. There was the siege that began in April, and then all through the summer, the Jews were trying to defend their city, and they had struggled to do so. But by the end of August 30th to be exact, the Roman armies overwhelmed their defenses, and they burned and destroyed the temple. And by burning it and destroying the temple, that was indicative of what Jesus had said concerning it. It was the exact fulfillment of what he had said back in verse 2. And so it is very appropriate then for him to refer to this as the sign of the Son of Man. It gave indisputable evidence that what he had predicted had come about in its entirety. And the language that he uses here to describe it, although it sounds very apocalyptic and it sounds like he is describing the end of the physical universe, the sun being darkened, the moon not giving its light, the stars falling from heaven, what he's doing is he's alluding to the Old Testament prophets who used this language to describe national disasters. Notice in Isaiah chapter 13, 9 through 13. Notice how similar the language is here. It says, "Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land a desolation and to destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of the heavens will not give their light, the sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. Therefore I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken out of its place at the wrath of the Lord of hosts in the day of his fierce anger." Now again, it sounds like he's describing the end of the universe. It sounds like he's describing the final judgment. But notice at the very beginning of this oracle who he assigns it to. He says, "The oracle concerning Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos saw." And so what Isaiah is describing here with this apocalyptic language, the sun being darkened, the moon not giving its light, the universe being shaken, was describing the destruction of Babylon. And this is something we see all throughout the Old Testament. He uses the same language to describe the fall of Tyre. Ezekiel uses this language to describe the fall of Egypt. And so it is perfectly appropriate for Jesus to use this language to describe the end of the Jewish state. If you think about the burning of the temple, what could it be more catastrophic to a first century Jew than to see the house of God and their capital city by extension going up in flames? That would have been the worst possible thing they could have ever witnessed. That was something that indicated that they had been rejected. Like a star out of heaven, this exalted nation whom the Lord had dealt with for so many thousand years was being cast to the ground. So Jesus here describes it as a climactic event. And what he says about them mourning, all of the tribes mourning when they see the Son of Man coming, I think it's worth noting that for the past 2,000 years or so, the Jews have mourned this very event, the burning of the temple, with an annual fast for nearly 2 millennia. And that is exactly what Jesus anticipated. But then he says that the elect, that is, the Christians, would be spared from this. He says in verse 31 that he will send out his angels with the loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. And the gathering, I think, here is a protective gathering. Notice how he used similar language in the chapter prior. He says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings." So like a hen gathering her chicks under her wings, the Lord had gathered his disciples, his elect, and spared them, protected them from this great calamity. The whole reason he is revealing this to the disciples is so that they could flee from it and not have to endure the horrific suffering that took place. And history tells us that the Jews, or rather the Christians, when they saw the Roman armies approaching, fled for Pella, which is on the other side of the Jordan River, and they waited there until the destruction had taken place. There was one commentator who indicated that there's reason to believe that not one Christian perished in this event. And I believe that is truly remarkable. Jesus said that he was going to gather his elect from one end of heaven to the other, and I believe that this is a protective gathering that is being described here. And then he brings us finally to his seal of certainty in verses 31 through 35. He says, "From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." And so he concludes here with this simple illustration of a fig tree. He says in the same way that they could detect the approach of summer based upon the budding of the fig tree, they could also detect the approach of the siege based upon the fulfillment of these things that he had described here. And I think that there may even be some prophetic significance with this fig tree illustration that he uses here. Because like I said, the siege began in April. It began in the spring. and lasted through the summer. And that is exactly when the fig tree would begin to bud, is in that early spring, and it would last, of course, through the summer. And so what he is telling them in either case is that judgment is coming against Jerusalem, and they needed to be ready for it in order that they may escape from Judea and be spared from this horrific act of judgment. He gives them his seal of certainty in verses 34 through 35, saying that this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And insofar as Jerusalem and the temple was concerned, every word that he spoke proved true, down to the last detail. Everything that he said here we can compare with the historical accounts and see that indeed every word that he spoke did not pass away. Not a single word fell to the ground. And I know that the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple by extension, is not as relevant to us as it was to the disciples of the first century, but we have to appreciate just how remarkable this prophecy was. Jesus, by foretelling these events with such clarity and precision, was giving us indisputable proof of his divine foreknowledge. In Isaiah 42, verse 9, the Lord says, "Behold, the former things have come to pass, and new things I now declare. Before they spring forth, I tell you of them." And so this was a testament to the Lord's divinity, that he had predicted these events prior. He said, "See, I have told you beforehand." This is a remarkable prophecy that was fulfilled in its entirety. And not only did it verify his power, it also foreshadowed the judgment that is to come. Because if what he said about the judgment of Jerusalem proved true, then certainly what he says in the next section regarding the judgment of the world will prove true as well. And that is what we will consider in the next hour, is the judgment of the world. I hope that this has been helpful for you. I know that there are probably still questions in this text that we've not been able to answer yet, but this, I hope, gives you the broad strokes of what is being dealt with here. We are seeing the fulfillment of a prophecy that Jesus had assigned to that generation, to that first century, that had been fulfilled in its entirety. We're going to be dismissed to our Bible classes, but before we do that, I'm going to lead us in a prayer. So if you would, please bow with me as we go to the Father.